everyone. Once again, my name is Shayla Biko, and I'm the Executive Director of Build Mobile. Before we get started, I just wanted to make a few housekeeping announcements. First and foremost, we made a commitment toward transparency in this process, and so we are live streaming our Zoning Technical Advisory Committee meeting. So we encourage the public to tune in and dial us up, and certainly we are happy to have participants in the actual meeting. To get us started, I'll go over a couple more things, and then we will go around the room, and if you would just give us your name and your professional expertise into this process would be helpful for those that are out in the viewing public. And then I will turn it over to Mark White to get us going. I don't want to eat into his time. But before we start with introductions, I had mentioned at our last gathering that we would post all of this information on our Map for Mobile website. That is live and up and running. And so in addition to the city's planning website, all of the modules that will be released throughout this process will be updated on the Map for Mobile website. We want to stick to our calendar as closely as possible, but if for some reason we have a date change, we will communicate through the website, through email, and other ways of public notice to publish any changes in the date. Because we had to adjust the schedule this week, we still have a couple of days left in our public review to get citizen feedback through that first stage. But as soon as that date ends, we will post that to the website, and I'll be sure to disseminate the questions that and responses that we've received so far. So my apologies for not having that today, but moving forward, we'll stick to our calendar. So with that, I will turn it over to the committee for introductions, and we'll start with Mr. Guess.
Good afternoon. I'm William Guess. I'm the chair for the Board of Adjustment, and also I work at University of South Alabama.
Good afternoon. I'm Pratt Thomas with Merrill P. Thomas Company. I'm in the commercial real estate industry.
My name is Carrie Marin. I am Director of Design with the Downtown Mobile Alliance, and I'm an architect on staff.
My name is Mark Wattier. I'm a professional land surveyor with Wattier Surveying.
My name is Rebecca Shaw. I'm a real estate investor and a real estate agent with Keller Williams.
I'm Matthew Barclift. I'm the engineering manager for development for Mobile County.
I'm David Schumer, Barton & Schumer Engineering. I'm a civil site design engineer.
Abe Harper, Harper Technologies, IT consulting and services professional, logistics and management.
I'm Christopher Grant with Thompson Engineering and Watermark Design. I'm a planner and landscape architect by trade.
I'm Darrell Russell with Malls. I'm engineering, planning, and manager for Malls.
I'm Mark White. I'm the consultant who's leading the code update process.
We've got staff in the back.
Brian Underwood, Deputy Director of Long Range Planning for the city.
Bert Hoffman, planner with Planning and Zoning Department.
Keena Andrews, planner with Engineering and Development.
And Matt Gala, urban designer and long range planning.
Jay, if you'd introduce yourself.
Jay Watkins with Maynard Cooper Gay.
And Ms. Sessions is coming in. Come on in. It's fine.
I'm not getting called out.
We're just doing introductions of the committee. You're right here. Yeah, right here. If you just introduce yourself.
Shirley Sessions with Regions Bank.
Okay, that's good. Okay. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. White.
Okay. Thank you, Shayla. And thanks to all of you for participating and being here again today. I'm going to cover just a little bit of background. Oh, is that not working?
Yeah, you got to hit it. I may need to go stand over there for you.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about, rehash a little bit about the background of the project, just to refresh your memories, and then talk about specifically some of the modules that have been released since the last time we were together. So a little bit about how we're going about doing all this, and what the current modules you're reviewing, and take questions on the existing ones. So anything that didn't come to mind the last time we were talking about, the zoning chapters, feel free to bring those up. So we'll go next. As I mentioned, this is a Unified Development Code. It implements Map for Mobile, which is the city's official statement of land use policy, along with the major street map. It is a multi-part ordinance that combines into one chapter the city's zoning and subdivision regulations. What you saw last time were the zoning districts and composite standards. So those have been up for a while. We've already gotten a number of comments on those from the public. Since we were here last time, we've put on the website the development standards, and that's one chapter that consolidates all of the substantive requirements for development and redevelopment in the city, and the processes, the workflows, which were released on Monday. So those two chapters were released. We're hoping next week to come out with the use regulations chapter, which will have standards for specific uses that need special treatment, either because of their unique impacts on neighborhoods or so forth, or because of state law requirements. Like any good example of that are cell towers, which have some requirements in federal law that the city needs to be responsive to in the regulations. Nonconformities and vested rights will be dealt with in a later module, and near the end we'll deal with what I like to call the easy stuff, the enforcement, the agencies, the boilerplate legal provisions, and then the final chapter, and there's some cross-references to that in the procedures chapter, but that will be a checklist of submittal requirements for applicants, along with the fees that have to attend each application that's filed. Next one. So I'll talk a little bit first about development standards and focus on what's new in the ordinance and what's changed from what you have today. Next one. We start out the chapter with just some general introductory provisions, but we've added some things about building design and building height because of the composite standards reference, some materials that relate to frontage types, those sorts of things. The frontage types haven't been fleshed out yet, but we have standards in there about building height, how you measure height, that sort of thing. The landscaping and tree preservation standards are in there, and they mirror the work that was done and has been done over the last year with the Right Tree, Right Place Committee that include a new tree list that the Planning Commission would adopt. It includes an alternative compliance provision that's administratively supervised, so it doesn't require discretionary approval, and to try to make things more flexible for applicants, and the parking and loading standards. And for the most part, both the landscaping and the tree standards have been calibrated to the zoning districts. What you have in place in the zoning ordinance today is one set of parking requirements. Downtown's exempt, and inside the Martin Luther King Boulevard, there's some different lower parking minimums that apply to the rest of the city. But today, the downtown, the neighborhood traditional, the neighborhood center traditional, and the traditional corridor districts don't have minimum parking requirements, and that reflects the urban character of those districts. And the landscaping requirements, and if you turn back to the zoning chapter, the landscaping requirements for the urban districts are cut way back. So the neighborhood center, it's 2 to 5%, and that reflects the urban character of those districts, the fact that we want buildings to the street, the parking lots will be hidden behind the buildings, that sort of thing, and the landscaping requirements are reduced to go hand in hand with that. On the other hand, west of 65, to reflect the more suburban character of those districts, the landscaping requirements have increased. Because what people who live in a suburban neighborhood want is more green space. People who live in an urban neighborhood want places that are more walkable. So we've calibrated those standards to reflect that. The parking and loading standards also have some new provisions that make it easier to get shared parking approval. So if I have a church that meets on Sunday morning and I got a big parking lot that sits empty the rest of the week, well, I can lease those spaces to a commercial business next to me, and that can count as the towards the minimum parking spaces that commercial business requires. And so that makes it easy for uses and developments to recycle spaces and to avoid the cost and expense and additional stormwater runoff and so on and so forth that goes hand in hand with new parking spaces. Next slide. The blocks, lots, and yards have some graphics and descriptions of, you know, where we measure the front, side, and rear lot lines and the rear yards from. It has new encroachment accommodations for things like front porches and other accessory features to a structure, and carries forward a site triangle provision. And so this chapter is mainly a way to to tell applicants, how we go about measuring those technical requirements that apply to the zoning districts. Next slide. This chapter also has new requirements that carry forward what's not in the code today, but it's used in practice for things like planning and development approval. And that's the traffic impact analysis requirement, and that's in the adequate public facility standards. And we've also indicated where different levels of service apply. So it doesn't apply in the urban neighborhoods, because we're not going to tear down historic buildings to extend a arterial road in in the urban areas of the community, but in areas that are developing, it has level of service standards that are consistent with the character of those areas. It carries forward your existing standards for easements and improvement guarantees. We haven't had a chance to sit down and have a heart-to-heart, with public works staff and engineering on how we deal with access management and driveways. As I understand it, that's kind of dealt with on a case-by-case basis today, but that's something I think we need to take a closer look at. Next slide. We have new standards also for lighting. There are some parking lot standards that were in place today for things like dealerships and so forth, but they didn't cover things like stadiums and other uses that can have fairly intensive lighting and light spillover that could be bothersome to neighborhoods next to them. So we've got some lighting intensity and directional standards in the new code that reflect what's in engineering manuals and the state of the practice for development. Next slide. The natural resource protection standards include a new riparian buffer requirement, and so that depends, depending on the size of your drainage area or whether the stream is natural or it's hardscaped today. The buffer can be up to 115 square feet. It's a 3-tier buffer, so there's less development permitted right next to a stream. There's more uses permitted in the next 50 feet in what we call Zone 2 than Zone 3, which is further upland. There are more uses and more impervious surfaces allowed, but this is designed to protect the quality of our streams, to minimize flooding event, to minimize having to make improvements, to widen drainage channels because people are building right up to it and so forth, and to minimize, the frequency of intense flooding events, and to help with that situation in Mobile, which is a very rainy city. If you'll notice from Article 3, the zoning district standards, we included civic space requirements for a lot of the mixed use and commercial districts. For the urban districts, and it's something we need to look at, I think, in the suburban districts as well, you can substitute civic spaces for landscaping, which that landscaping tends to be dead space. It makes your property more attractive, but it's not as functional. Here we've added civic space standards for things like courtyards and walkways and other areas that would enhance new commercial development in the city. And so that is everything from a naturalized open space or a stream corridor in a new subdivision in the west part of Mobile or the unincorporated area, all the way up to what you'd see in a more urban area where you have smaller, more hardscape spaces. For most of the districts, they only kick in when your site's 1 acre or larger. So for small lots that have really tight space, we don't require the civic space standards. Next slide. And then we carry forward the standards for stormwater management, which is largely governed by Chapter 17 of the City Code. We've carried those forward along with what's in your subdivision regulations today. For streets, though, we've added new street geometric design standards that work hand in hand with MAP for Mobile that have some standards for a more urban situation, a new subdivision in the unincorporated part of the county that's building cul-de-sacs and, you know, which you typically see in that part of the county, all the way to a community that's, you know, that's more urban in character, whether it's a new mixed-use community that wants to use narrower street widths and a more walkable streetscape. The standards are set in place for those, along with narrower streets in areas where we're trying to protect environmental resources. So if you're near a stream buffer or something, it allows a narrower street width and concessions for sidewalks and those sorts of things to minimize pavement near the stream sections. And that's also to make sure, you know, one of the themes of our new ordinance is to make sure that it's integrated internally and that all our standards are pointing applicants in the same direction. So if we want people to protect streams, we don't want to require wider streets in and near stream resources in the city. So that works hand in hand with that. Next slide. And so the next chapter is the processes section. And this chapter consolidates all of the zoning processes, subdivision approval, how you go through the Board of Adjustment if somebody needs a variance or if they disagree with a staff decision on something, so how they go through that process, and then finally building permits. So if you want to go to the next slide. We start out with just some, these workflows, by the way, will work hand in hand with some of the chapters that are coming later. The most important one being the submittal requirements, because that chapter will have a checklist of all the information that needs to be provided to the city to have an application that's right for the city to review. So all of that will be consolidated in that chapter so that it's not cluttering up, you know, either our substantive standards or our description in Article 5 of how the workflows operate. The enforcement section will be dealt with in a separate chapter, and that's largely a function of state law, along with, you know, formally setting up the agencies or recognizing agencies that are creatures of state law, like the Board of Adjustment, and, you know, what those agencies do, what their authority is. So those will come later. Next slide. In each of these sections, each section of the ordinance that gets into the specific processes, we follow the same writing style and the same order of information. So each section starts out with an applicability section, and that says what, you know, who has to go through this process. For example, you know, if you're subdividing property, obviously you have to get a preliminary plat. Or if you're a minor subdivision, you just need to file a minor plat. Then it talks about how you get the process started. Who do you file the application with? And then, you know, how does the city go about determining whether or not the application is complete? And the general section of the ordinance talks about, you know, time limits for the city to report back to the applicant on, you know, whether the application is complete, and if not, if you're missing any information and so forth. And that's to streamline the process, to make sure applications aren't held up indefinitely, and that, you know, you wait and wait and wait, and finally you hear that you don't have enough information. So it puts the onus on the city to expeditiously process applications. Then we have a provision on whether notice is provided, and if so, you know, what kind of notice and who the notice goes to. Then we have a section on how the decisions are made. Who makes the decision? Is there a public hearing? How does the public hearing work? And then what criteria apply to approval? You know, what decision making, in addition to, for example, you know, every subdivision, if you're inside the city limits, has to comply with the zoning district standards in terms of if there's a minimum lot size requirement, if there's a, you know, other things that that affect how you lay out lots. Are there any special approval criteria for that particular application? Then if there's a few of these rezoning, conditional use permits, have some limits on refiling. So if you've already been through the process, you've your application's been denied, it puts a limit on people turning around the next day or the next week and just refiling the same application and wasting everybody's time, wasting the applicant's time, and so forth. So there's a waiting period for those applications that have been denied, from coming back and refiling if they're discretionary. There's a provision on who you appeal to if there's an appeals process, and whether that goes to the Board of Adjustment, whether it goes to City Council, or whether you just go to court in the case of if you don't like your decision on a rezoning or a subdivision plat. There's not an appeals process in the city. You just go to court. So it mentions that, and then there's a provision on what the scope of the approvals, and that's what things does this permit authorize you to do. If I get a rezoning, that doesn't necessarily mean you can just go out and start building, right? You still have to get a building permit. You got to get a certificate of occupancy. If I've got preliminary plat approval, right? I don't have I don't go to the probate court and record a preliminary plat. I have to go get my final plat approved. So it scopes all that out so people know what the next step in each of these processes is. And then finally, a provision on how we keep track of the decisions that were made. So most of them require the applicant, to keep track of their own permits, as well as the director of planning to keep track of the permits. So we can start, make sure that before somebody goes to building permit, for example, if they got a rezoning and there were conditions attached, that there's a way to go back and make sure, where we go to make sure we know what those conditions of approval were. So next. And there's also a summary table for each of the processes at the beginning that talks about, for each of these processes, first of all, what do each of these agencies do, like the Planning Commission? Do they actually decide the application, or do they just make a recommendation? And if so, is there a public hearing, or is there just a public meeting? How does that occur? So like for preliminary plans, the Planning Commission makes the decision. For a text amendment or rezoning, the Planning Commission just makes a recommendation, unless it's a text amendment for subdivision plats. In that case, or subdivision provisions of the UDC, they would actually make the decision. And for each of these, whether notice is required, and if so, what kind of notice applies. So state law requires for rezonings and for zoning text amendments that there be something published in the newspaper. And so that's the kind of notice you would have for rezoning. Now, on the notice provisions, nothing there stops the city from providing extra notice. This is all the notice that's required by state law, or in the past, the notice that the city has wanted to hold itself to as a matter of policy. On all of these, the city will, and I know Build Mobile's doing things also to make information available online. There are other things the city can do as well to get the word out if there are new applications, to give the public access to information that's been provided. So none of this means that the city can't go above and beyond what's shown here, or that the applicant can't go above and beyond what's shown here to let people know, what's coming in any application. Next slide. A couple of things that are new here. First are a pre-application process. The city has this in place today. It's got a pre-application process and it's got a pre-development process that's optional. You don't have to go through it. Here it would be required unless the planning director finds that you've been through this so many times, you already know the drill, and it would just be a waste of everybody's time because applicant knows what's expected of them. The city officials know that this applicant has been around the horn so many times it would be a waste of time to take them through this. But for everyone else that's going through the process, you would have to go through pre-application, provide staff an overview of what your project is, so it doesn't require final engineering plans or anything like that. It would be conceptual information. You would have a dialogue not only with planning staff, but with engineering, public works, other officials who will be involved in processing and approving your application, so that the applicant knows what's expected of them before they go through and spend all their money on the process. And then the city would just certify. So there's no approval. I mean, the city just doesn't approve you or deny you. They just make a formal certification that you've actually sat down and talked to them. And after that, you can start going through the application process. The next slide is the neighborhood meeting process, where ultimately, and I know this looks like an extra step to applicants, and it is, but ultimately it streamlines discretionary approvals. So for things like rezonings and conditional use permits and preliminary plats that are discretionary, if you're in the more urban districts and you don't, you're going to have a lot of neighbors around you. If you're building in a floodplain or something like that where there are issues, particular issues going on, then we require a neighborhood meeting to proceed your application. So you would notify the neighborhood 10, 14 days in advance or so, conduct the meeting, give the planning staff a statement that the meeting occurred and what issues were raised, how you dealt with them, and then you file your application. What this is not is a neighborhood veto, and the purpose statement makes this clear. It's possible, there's always somebody, you can come to terms with, just about everybody around you, and there may be that one person who still doesn't like what you're doing. And we're not going to let that one person hold you up. You still have the right to file your application. If there's a public hearing, that person can show up and make their feelings known. They're going to be asked by the Planning Commission or City Council, did you go to the neighborhood meeting? Did you try to work things out? But this gives you the opportunity to sort those things out before they land in the Planning Commission's chair or the City Council's chair. And in communities that have used this, they find that for most applications, not all of them, for most applications the process works a lot more smoothly than it does when people just file their application and provide the minimum notice, and the first time anybody hears anything about it is when they're at the public hearing, prepared to fight. Right? So we're trying to avoid that kind of situation from happening as much as possible. And I've sat down with, some attorneys, I've sat down with other folks who have gone through the process here in Mobile and have used it on their own, right, without even the ordinance requirement. And I think that, the smarter applicants tend to do this and try to sort things out in good faith with neighborhoods anyway. But it's a best practice, and so we're recognizing it in the ordinance today. I don't expect every neighborhood to be as happy as these folks shown in the slide, but we do hope it'll smooth the development approval process in the future. Next slide. So these are the three processes in zoning are either the text amendment or conditional uses, and then we've included a process for what we call alternative compliance. And so the zoning text amendment and zoning map amendment, or otherwise known as a rezoning, works the same way it does today. You need a planning commission approval. Planning commission has a public hearing. Planning commission makes a recommendation to city council. City council makes the final decision. It all has to be noticed. And the minimum notice state law requires is published notice in the newspaper. So that's the way it works today. The one change is in this. Again, this goes back to Article 3, which is the zoning districts today. Under the current ordinance, planned unit development is only processed by the Planning Commission. It goes to the City Council on appeal. Today, it would be a zoning district. So it would require a rezoning every single time. Now, we're hoping that planned development becomes the exception to the rule, that people are able to find something they can work with in all the other districts, and planned development would be something when you just can't make any of the other districts work for you. And so that way, we hope that'll be an exception to the rule. And of course, the new plan development regulations don't have all the fussy standards about how much open space you provide and building design and et cetera, because it's a negotiated discretionary approval process. It's designed deliberately to be open-ended. The conditional use process replaces what's called planning commission approval today. And that process goes to the planning commission for a recommendation. Today it stops there. Under the new processes, technically it goes to city council, but we've recognized that council has the opportunity and will create a consent agenda approval, where they can rely on the hearing and recommendation that the Planning Commission made. They can review the evidence that was presented to the Planning Commission and make their approvals. And they can do that all at once on consent agenda. or they could reopen it if they want to. But I think, it would be a waste of time for council to always hear this a second time. But best practices, most communities in Alabama, I think, send this to city council or their legislative body, so we followed that model here. The new thing we've added is what we've called alternative compliance. And it deals with two different things. I think David, and not meaning to call you out or embarrass you, last time you asked for, what do we do if somebody's got an existing planned unit development approval? And they have some minor changes they want to make. How can we process them without sending all the way back, to the beginning of the monopoly board and send them all the way back through the planning commission public hearing process? So this has some parameters where if you're within a certain number of square feet of what was approved or so forth, you're only reducing your parking or open space by a limited amount. You can go back through and get it processed administratively. You don't have to go back to square one and get yourself pre-approved. So it addresses that comment that was raised, and it was a good one. A lot of communities have this when they have planned unit development, and we're going from one system to another, one way of processing it to another, but we're recognizing that there's a lot of folks out there that will have existing planned unit development approvals. So this allows them to make some minor changes as market demands or whatnot dictate, and they can do that administratively. The second thing it recognizes too is minor changes or adjustments to things like landscaping, parking, your yard front, side, rear yard requirements or so forth, that today would send you through the Board of Adjustment. Here, instead of defining that as an exception that requires a variance, well, legislatively, if this is approved, the city will pre-approves certain deviations from your baseline standards that can be processed administratively. So, that X% change in your setback or building height or whatnot, which today sends you to the Board of Adjustment. It requires a public hearing. Now you can just get administrative approval for that. If you go beyond those thresholds, then you would need a variance. Or maybe you need to look and see if there's another zoning district that works better for you, in which case you can ask for a rezoning. So hopefully this will take off the table a lot of the things that tie up the Board of Adjustment's time, the City Council's and Planning Commission's time today, and make the process work better for applicants without degrading the integrity of our zoning districts. So that's why that process is there. And of course, if you're denied or there's something you disagree with, you still have the opportunity to go to the Board of Adjustment from a decision on an administrative, an alternative compliance. And that's just state law. State law allows that if you disagree with a zoning decision that was made administratively. Next slide. Subdivision processes mirror what you have today. So we've got the preliminary plat, followed by engineering, approved by Planning Commission, followed by engineering plans, followed by administrative approval of the final plat, and then you go to the probate court and record your final plat. We've also recognized that for text amendments that affect the subdivision aspects of the Unified Development Code under state law, those go only to the Planning Commission. City Council does not have authority to change those, even though they're hosted under the same cover in the city code. So those would go to only the Planning Commission. Next slide. So those mirror what's done today. We've also included, and we flow charted each of those processes. So the preliminary plat shows you, how you get to the Planning Commission, what happens after they make their decision, the engineering plat approval, all the way to minor plats, which only require final plat approval. You don't have to go through the preliminary plat step if you've got less than 5 lots. Next slide. We've also put in several streamlined processes for things that aren't subdivisions, but they may affect existing lots. So, for example, if you want to change the boundary of a recorded lot. You need to shift the boundary over a few feet or something, which today would require planning commission approval. We've got an administrative approval process for that now. So now you don't have to go to a public hearing just to have these minor things done to your lot. So that can get stamped approved by the planning staff, and then you can record it and go about your business without having to go through the public hearing process. We've also got a registration process for plat vacations. So if you have an existing plat, you haven't sold any lots, you can just inform planning staff in writing that you're vacating this plat and go forward and record the plat vacation with the probate court without having to go back to the planning commission for a public hearing. Next slide. And then we recognize existing practice today, which again, some communities require site plan approval for building permits and certificates of occupancy for some uses. Right now, you just apply to the building official, which is part of Chapter 11 of the City Code under the building code. They refer that application to the planning director, who will determine whether or not you're in compliance with the Unified Development Code. They report back to the building official, and then they approve your application. And so the planning staff would certify whether or not you comply. If they say that you're not in compliance, and at that point you would have the ability to go on up to the Board of Adjustment and appeal that decision. Next slide. And then finally, there's the zoning appeals and variances. And again, this is all state law. This is all driven by state law. So if you disagree with the decision that was made that relates to zoning, not to subdivision approval, but to zoning on an application, on a building permit or a certificate of occupancy, on an alternative compliance application, you think there's just a mistake that staff made, or if you need a variance in order to get your approval, then you can file that application with the Board of Adjustments. There's a completeness review, a notification process, and then after the Board of Adjustment makes their decision, at that point you can appeal to court. So those processes, and again, those are driven by state law, but those are reflected and flow charted in the ordinance. Next slide. So that's it. Those are the modules that you have in front of you today. What you've had so far in advance, but not a lot of days in advance of the last meeting, you had the zoning chapter, the composite design standards in front of you. I got some comments last time. You've had a little bit more time to think about them, to read through them, and now we have the development standards and the processes. We deliberately started with the stuff that we thought would be the most difficult and perhaps the most controversial to deal with. And so I'm sure there's a lot of things those of you who go through the zoning process on a day-to-day basis have probably thought of, or anything else you can think of. So with that, I'll discontinue my presentation and just open the floor for any questions you might have. Any thoughts or comments from the committee?
I guess I'll start.
Okay.
With the concept of this neighborhood meeting.
Yes.
As a practitioner, we advise our clients on big projects that's what they need to do, particularly things that are going to be controversial or going to have some hair on them. It's better to go ahead and get out there. I note that we make a differentiation here for minor subdivisions, 5 lots or less, but I'm just not sure that a neighborhood meeting is going to be required or would be beneficial for those type of small subdivisions, or if you've got somebody coming in for a 1-lot, legal lot of record type subdivision because you need to get a meets and bounds converted to a plat. Have y'all considered some standard for what's going to be required to go to this neighborhood type meeting that may call out some of the less controversial or more minimal type approval requests that are coming through?
Yes, it only applies to preliminary plats. So for a minor plat, you just go straight to final. So that wouldn't be a requirement for just a minor plat, and nor does it require by the terms of the draft to the minor lot adjustments that we've defined or plat vacations. So those things are automatically exempt.
Even with if you've got a 20-lot cul-de-sac subdivision, you're talking about a neighborhood meeting?
Yes. And those can be controversial. I know my very first meeting here, June of 2016, I remember there was a small subdivision that got a lot of neighborhood comment. I mean, people showed up and they were commenting on the drainage was their big issue. And that's something where I thought, if that applicant had talked to the neighbors, maybe they could have worked something out before the planning commission. So, I've seen those draw a lot of comment and controversy, even right here in Mobile. So, any other questions?
I've got a question on the minor plat process. A lot of times right now, if somebody wants to develop a piece of property, it's just one lot, but it's not a legal lot of record. It's just a meets and bounds piece of property. We're required to file a one-lot subdivision application, which makes that a lot, in a subdivision from that point. The way I read the minor plat, number one, the minor plat is a subdivision which includes up to 5 lots created from one or more land parcels constituting an existing subdivision. So the way I read this minor plat, it's like if we're re-subdividing something that's already part of a subdivision, it's less than 5 lots, and there's no construction, then it qualifies for a minor plat. But what about a piece of property that's a meets and bounds property that was not part of an existing subdivision?
That should go under, that's a good question. That's a good comment. I'm glad you made that. That should go under minor lot adjustments. I don't think that's something that we have listed, but that would be a good thing to add, I think, to that section. Because most what this deals with, in errors in courses or distance or, to change your lot boundary, that sort of thing. But what you're talking about is something we would need to add to that list. Because I think what you're suggesting, I'm implying from your comments that, that's something that would benefit from an administrative approval. Not having to go to the planning commission and have a public hearing on that doesn't make any sense. So that's a good one. I'll put that on the list to add to that.
Would there be a requirement to record a plat under the minor lot adjustment? Would it be?
Yes, you would go back and record it, and you would want to. I mean, you would want that in the land records.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
I got a question. Sure.
Yes, Christopher?
I haven't heard much around the pre-application process. I know, in terms of an outside consultant coming in, it seems to be very, very beneficial on both parts, from the municipal side as well as the developer or consultant side, to have that initial kickoff meeting where the engineer and the planner and et cetera are in the room and starting to, before a developer spends $1 million on an engineered plan to come in as a preliminary or plat, essentially, is there written into here that pre-application process?
Yes, it's in the requirements. Okay. In the applicability section for the preliminary meetings, I think that's what you're talking about, the pre-application meetings. So it's in the applicability section there.
Okay.
So that's to clarify that, this applies. So if you go to 64-73, it applies to any rezoning, conditional use permit, Board of Adjustment case, or any preliminary subdivision plans. So all of those have to go through, and then the planning director, can waive that if they find that, the applicant doesn't need it.
Got it. It says, you make application to building official. Typically right now, when you submit something, and Carrie can talk about the building stuff, but usually whether it meets the zoning is the site. Is the building official part of the planning staff that reviews for zoning compliance now, or who is the building official that determines the the director for compliance?
That's the building official under Chapter 11 of the city code. That's not the planning staff. Am I right, Shayla? That's different. It's a different department. They host, by virtue of Chapter 11, they're the official that formally issues the building permit. What this does, and that building permit has to comply with zoning. What this says is, the building inspector, those folks don't usually deal with zoning. They deal with whether your building's going to stand up, whether it meets the IBC requirements or not. They don't deal with zoning. So what this does is when you file that application, it gets sent to the planning department. Then planning will determine and they will certify whether or not it complies with the zoning requirements. And they give that certification to the building official, and that becomes part of their records that allows them to issue the building permit. Okay. So that's the way it works. That's my understanding of how it works today internally. And so this just makes sure in black and white it's right there.
Yeah,
so
that's what I was saying. It's usually the staff, the planning staff, who coordinates the site plan with the zoning codes.
Right.
Not the building official. They just, make the recommendation to the building official. Or
building official just sends that part of the application. They just send the application to planning staff. And that way everybody knows that this application is here. And they're all looking at the same application as well. And so we know the applicant hadn't sent one thing to the building official and another thing to planning staff, for example. That single application goes to the building official and then it gets distributed. And then, this is how planning staff deals with their little corner of these regulations, which is the UDC. Yes, sir.
Will the actual landscape ordinance itself be rolled into the UDC?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's part of it, and that's in the development standards. So that's at Article 4, which consolidates parking, landscaping, etc. So that's all part of that section of the ordinance. And we had a number of meetings over the past year with the Right Tree, Right Place Committee, where we talked about that. I think one companion document that will be adopted with this is the official tree list that we've said the Planning Commission would adopt as a companion piece to the ordinance, and that's something that makes it easier to amend over time as a reference document. And it reflects all the technical work that was done by that committee.
You mentioned sharing parking lots.
Yes.
That's common now. I had a project that's under construction that we had to share the parking lot. They did it as an administrative PUD. Is that something that would fall under an administrative PUD, or was that something that staff can make the call on during the building permit process?
Staff would make the call on them under this ordinance.
As a PUD or as?
No, just as it would approve your shared parking plan. So it would just determine that, it needs to know, first of all, how many spaces, right, you're sharing, and, what your arrangements are to make sure those spaces are actually going to be available as parking spaces. And that's what they need to know. So they just need to know what that information is, but then they can approve it. We've gotten rid of, and this is more broadly speaking, right now, you put two buildings on a property, you got to go through planning and development approval. We've gotten rid of that. So this doesn't require a public hearing or anything like that.
Okay,
so it's a more streamlined process for sharing that parking.
Yeah, the two separate properties wouldn't kick it to the Planning Commission either.
Correct, yes.
I haven't had a chance to review this before today, and the information just goes through so quickly that I got to take some time to process it and gather thoughts about it. Are we using this time just to comment on what's been presented today, or the zoning module as well, or?
All of it.
Yeah, all of it. So if you want to go back to what we presented last month, that this is the opportunity.
Okay. One thing, under the contents in Chapter 64, Unified Development Code, it's just a technicality. It looked like under contents there were a number of sections that were just mislabeled. For example, 64-105, it's labeled as oil storage tanks, but then if you flip a couple pages, 105 is shown as fences.
Oh, you're talking about Article 6, where we have the sign regulations?
No, this is zoning districts. Excuse me.
Apologize. That's Article 6.
Okay, excuse me, Article 6, yeah.
Right. That section, what you have in front of you today, and the work we did on that was just the sign regulations. The entire rest of that chapter is really a placeholder. Now, we put in, just to park the language there, we put in a few things on accessory uses or whatever. That particular chapter we're working on this week, so that should be out next week. What we did release before the last meeting was the sign standards. So the sign standards are in a reviewable initial draft form. The rest of it is coming later. So yes, what I probably didn't do was regenerate that table of contents. But that'll be redone with the next set of amendments to that chapter.
And then in the chart of permitted uses, under education uses, business, college, school, personal instruction, it looks like those uses are permitted under corridor mixed, corridor traditional, but then not shown as permitted under public or institutional.
Okay, I'm trying to get to where you are here under educational uses.
Right. Public, civic, institutional.
Page 22.
Yeah, page 22.
Yeah, public or private, you mean? Right, they're conditional and RL all the way up to downtown, and then conditional and corridor traditional and corridor mixed, which I think mirrors what the city has today in terms of where and how it processes schools.
But the public institutional zoning classification wouldn't allow for...
It doesn't have it, but that's
schools?
a good point. Maybe that's probably something we should allow there.
And then, you know, some of the feedback I've gotten from realtors has been that they're just curious what the process will be in reviewing the zoning and what opportunity will they have. I mean, of course, you know, there's opportunity to comment, but in the event that the future land use map, or there's another zoning map that will follow?
Right. The zoning map would be adopted as part of the UDC because it includes the zoning districts, and the map has to go hand in hand with it because you don't know where those districts are unless you've got a map that tags, you know, that site to the applicable regulations. And, you know, we've got a comment period, you know, for each of these sections, and so when that map goes up, you know, there'll be an opportunity to comment and say, look, you know, we know the future land use map shows my map as RM, but, you know, we were planning to use it for commercial or something else, and here's what we've done, and we're currently zoned, you know, B2 or whatever, right? So that opportunity, the opportunity to do all that will be available to people, you know, to make the case for zoning their property other than something that's shown on the future land use map today. Now, without anyone telling us, right, we don't know what everybody's plans are. There are thousands of people out there, and some people don't have any current plans for their property. Some of them have plans that are ready to go. And so applicants can come to us and make that case. And, you know, if we think it, you know, has merit, then we can make that change to the map and hopefully sort those issues out before this goes to the Planning Commission. You know, in a perfect world, you know, the map exactly mirrors the future land use map, but we know that, you know, there's going to be people who have something different going on, and so we can have those discussions with people, you know, once the zoning map of this is released.
So those comments should come after the zoning map is rolled out?
Yes. Now people, you know, right now the future land use map kind of shows you what we're planning the zoning to be. So, I mean, people can start today to look at that and tell us that, you know, there's some reason why our classification should be different than what's shown on that. So that opportunity exists now. We haven't started that 30-day or whatever number of day comment period on the map, but people can still come forward and tell us, because, you know, we know that that's important. tends to be one of the biggest issues with the zoning anyway, is how's my, you know, what's my property mapped? That's always a tough one to get through. So the advantage of having that future land use map is it does give you an idea of what our plans are for zoning. And so by looking at that, people know today, you know, kind of what we're planning, you know, to zone that property, and they can start that comment period with us.
Yeah.
And I would recommend, you know, using the public review tool that we have out there to communicate with us in writing, so that we'll be able to specifically take the time and get more information to make sure that, you know, we're making a good recommendation as it relates to that property. That doesn't mean to say we're going to just change it based on what the form is requesting, but that'll be our formal way of at least considering the request as they come.
And so then requests come to Mark or to you, and how do they know how it's being processed or anything like that?
Well, we will, as the zoning, when we get to the stage where the zoning map is rolled out, the first draft or the first stab at it will be done by our internal planning team that's been working on this. And it's a cross-functional team of planners, engineers, historic preservationists, all of the disciplines within the city will sit in a room similar to this and using this as our guide as we make those recommendations. And so this will be our starting point.
Right. Yes, Christopher?
I'm obviously a visual person, but so my question leads into, does it make sense for the signs, for instance, to be either incorporated into the graphic standards of a lot, you know, for instance, a multifamily or a strip commercial, or, you know, monument goes here, building facade sign, you know, front facade or wall sign, or can there be some associated graphics just relative to the sign ordinance that shows where that monument sign is, or where things are placed? To me, it just might help graphically.
Yes, yeah, we can work on that.
Okay, cool. And maybe the same goes in terms of the landscape ordinance, that's vehicular use area, or, you know, parking lot, aisle, or, you know, what that becomes.
Certainly. And I know the downtown regulations today do have graphics for their signs, so we can, you know, do something similar to what they did. And those are three-dimensional. They kind of show you what a wall sign looks like in context with a building downtown. And so we can flesh that out for other types of development situations as well. Any other questions or comments anyone has?
Under the rezoning piece that was put out just recently that we're talking about today, under the current zoning ordinance, if an applicant comes before the planning commission for a rezoning, there's pretty well-defined standards that the planning commission can use to evaluate that request. What I'm reading here is that those standards aren't implemented. It looks like it's intended to be more discretionary. Is that?
Yes, well, it's discretionary today too, actually, because you know, zoning or rezoning, as I understand it in Alabama, you know, is considered a legislative decision. It's not an administrative decision. It's not a quasi-judicial decision. It's considered a legislative decision. So what this draft does is it kind of recognizes that's what the law is here in this state. We, you know, we want to make sure that, you know, it's consistent with the plan, and we want to make sure it's consistent with, you know, map for Mobile and future land use map and that sort of thing. But otherwise, you know, it's what their legislative decision on that is. So it's totally, I mean, it is, you know, that's the way it is under the law today. I think even with those criteria in place, they're not strict, they're not like a building permit criteria. They're more guidelines than anything. We did get rid of, though, in this draft, the minimum area requirements for all the zoning districts, so those are gone. The zoning districts just need to line up with the future land use map, but other than that, it doesn't matter how much land area it has. They can be smaller, and sometimes, you know, a smaller neighborhood center zoning is better than a large-scale, you know, strip center in the middle of a neighborhood. So that should facilitate that type of development pattern.
When will use regulations come out on drive-through businesses? We reviewed it at the last meeting.
That's next week. That's not the supplemental use regulations.
Okay.
That's when those
or
are.
next meeting, not next.
Yes, next meeting, but next week is when we plan to have the draft out for those.
And related to the drive-through, back to the chart of permitted uses on page 21, in a neighborhood center, a restaurant with a drive-through would not be allowed. Am I reading that correctly? And then in a district center, it would be allowed with a conditional use permit?
Go into that section. Yes, with the drive-in restaurant, yes, conditional. The drive-through isn't allowed in the neighborhood center, but it's conditional in the district center and downtown, and it's allowed by right in a commercial traditional corridor or the mixed-use corridor, which captures most of your business districts today, especially what you see in the more suburban parts of the city. Well, as I understand it, as we were trying to match not only the uses that were appropriate for the future land use, but also kind of carrying forward what's in place today to avoid nonconformities and that sort of thing. I think that's how it's treated today in the districts that align the closest to those districts. So that doesn't mean they need to stay that way, but you know, and especially with next week, you know, we'll have some standards for drive-throughs. If the community feels that that takes care of their concerns enough, you know, that we don't have to send it through a hearing, then we can, you know, we can make those permitted as well.
In just the two areas that I saw where it didn't seem to make sense to me was along Spring Hill Avenue in Crichton, which would be labeled as the neighborhood center, where a restaurant with a drive-through wouldn't be allowed. And then the district center would be, you know, I-65 Airport Boulevard area, where the restaurant with the drive-through wouldn't be allowed either. Those just seem to be two areas that stick out to me where that's
so in the district center, which would be that area along 65 and Airport Road, yeah, it would seem to make more sense there. Maybe it should be allowed by right, is what you're saying?
I would think so, yeah, and then along Spring Hill Avenue as well.
Even the Midtown Publix, no, can't drive through it. It's a neighborhood center.
And Spring Hill has a lot of different zoning categories, so I'm wondering which specific area.
Yeah, this is east of I-65, near where Moffett comes in.
Okay, so it's probably a traditional corridor. In the traditional corridors, they are permitted by right. I think that probably, I may be wrong, but I think that covers the area you're talking about. And that's already by right in the matrix.
Okay, it just look, let's see. Well, the traditional corridor looks to be more pink, and this is more purple along Spring Hill Avenue.
There are two different types of neighborhood centers, suburban and traditional.
So the area you're concerned about is again, you want to show us?
Yeah.
So this is the area that I'm referencing
here.
And that's, yeah, neighborhood center traditional. That's where they're not allowed.
Right, but they're literally, I mean, you know, there's
Tons of them out there today, you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
And then the same for this area. You know.
Yeah, in this area, it is more, that's more the long-term character of that area too. This area, you know, maybe conditional use at least, because they're not allowed at all right now. Okay. All right.
The only new development in that area has been restaurants and drive-throughs.
Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts or comments either on the zoning or the composite standards, you know, those building design and site design standards?
I have a question, I don't know where it falls, but going with the change of use, if this gets implemented and there's a tire or auto repair shop in the commercial or corridor mixed zone and somebody buys it, wants to turn it into a hair salon, would that kick in it? You know, it's currently, I guess it would be non-conforming if it didn't meet all of the zoning criteria that this is. Would that kick in the redevelopment of the site to bring it up to these standards?
Now you're saying if somebody's got a tire shop and they want to convert to a hair salon,
well, they sell
and it's
it.
not allowed,
It becomes abandoned or vacant because it closes, and then someone wants to buy it and turn it into a different use. I don't know the different types of uses, services versus repair or you know, something like that. Would they, currently you have to bring the site into compliance when you have a change of use. Would that still remain in effect with all of this?
We're looking at that at two different levels. And again, we haven't got to the nonconformity section. That's coming later, but we are looking for the standards we're releasing next week at an adaptive reuse provision, because we've had people, for example, redevelop historic buildings as loft apartments or something, and that has triggered all kinds of landscaping and parking and et cetera. And I know one of them, I drove by, the parking lot's, you know, half empty, and I'm just wondering if that space could have been better used. And so we've got an adaptive reuse provision that accommodates what you're talking about. You know, if the use is allowed in the district, you know, allowing them to change those uses without having to trigger brand new parking and landscaping and et cetera provisions. And it would encourage those buildings to be repurposed, and repurposed without having to take people through some long, you know, public hearing process. And so that's part of it. But if you don't meet those standards, and that's for buildings that are older, you know, 50 years or older or something, or they're designated historic or whatever. And then for other buildings, we're taking a look at, we're still talking through alternatives to deal with non-conformance as to site improvement standards. And there are different ways to deal with that. I mean, we have, you know, what the city's done today, for example, downtown, you know, with the parking lot masking, that, you know, if you had a parking lot that's not masked 2 years ago, you had 2 years to bring it into compliance. And even though the ordinance has been on the books, people are now starting to find out, right, that applies. You're having to come into compliance. That's one way to deal with it, and it's the more aggressive way. The other way is, you know, if you're legally established, you can, you know, you can still expand, but you don't have to, or you can reuse if you're not expanding that property without having to bring your parking or landscaping into compliance. That's the most permissive. And then, you know, whatever's in between. So if you're doing certain things, maybe, you know, we can take you through a discretionary process and, you know, to the extent feasible, allow people to come up to date. You know, there may be situations where because of the site and the topography and everything, it might not be possible for people to come completely into compliance, but to allow through some sort of process, either through the director or otherwise, them to provide a plan for either over time coming into compliance or finding other ways maybe to deal with the issues that we otherwise resolve through parking and landscaping and so forth. So we're sorting through all that for things that don't qualify as adaptive reuse. So that'll be dealt with in several different ways in the new code. Yes, Christopher?
We talked a little bit about the riparian buffer areas, and I know Mobile's obviously been trying to do a lot on the Greenway, Blueway side of things, and my question centers around, will it spell out in any way any improvements to those riparian areas, or will it be there to be non-developable, left natural, or you know, is there an opportunity that, you know, there could be access granted? That's, you know, trying to figure out a way that those riparian areas could potentially be linked into the Greenway, Blueway, big schematic of things.
They could. This, you know, we're not using this as a way to, you know, take people's property. It's still private property. Right. So, you know, these are just development limitations. If the city wants, you know, if an applicant wants to donate this to the city or donate a riparian buffer to the city, they're welcome to do that. But these regulations certainly don't require that. Sure. They can be fenced. They can be, you know, you can restrict access to them and so forth. But we do the chapter, the development standards chapter, does have specific limitations in each tier of the buffer on what you can do. So we have tier 1, you know, 25 feet from the stream, you know, is the area of, you know, that's where we have the strictest regulations on land disturbance and what you can put there, how you can use it, because that's the area that's, you know, most directly impacts the stream. The area, you know, 25 to 50 feet, you know, there's more you can do. You can pave it a little bit, but not much, and then the areas up above, there are more uses that are allowed. So we've got a 3-tier stream buffer system in place that's fairly precise about what you can do in each of those zones, both in terms of use and in terms of land disturbance. But there's nothing in there that requires anybody to actually let go of their property.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit more about what does and does not trigger the neighborhood meeting? For example, you know, if an old abandoned building is renovated into lofts, the example we discussed a few minutes ago, potentially along a traditional corridor, it's within a neighborhood. So kind of digging into the weeds a little bit, but would that trigger a neighborhood meeting?
And I want to tag on to that for a second. Who is intended to be included in the neighborhood meeting? You're requiring them to provide certified mail receipts, but I don't see any guidance as to, you know, are we going 300 feet? Are we going adjacent property owners? Are we going, you know, next street over?
Well, well, let me address the first requirement. There are 2 questions here, Becca's question was, you know, what I'm reusing an old loft or something, and I'm going to redevelop it as apartments, right? Loft apartments. Well, first thing you have to look is what kind of application do you need? So if that redevelopment, if that use is allowed by right in your district, you don't need a neighborhood meeting because it's none of the applications that are listed. It doesn't need a rezoning. It doesn't need a conditional use permit. You're not appealing to the Board of Adjustment yet, you know, unless you get an adverse decision from staff, and you don't need a preliminary plat. So you're just reusing that building. That wouldn't. Now, if the use you want to reuse that building for is not allowed in the district, then you'd have to rezone it. In that case, if it's in any of the locations listed in subsection A2, so if it's in, you know, a neighborhood center, or a district center, or any of those others that are shown in map for Mobile, or it's in the downtown district, you know, if it requires a change of use or a replat, it's in a flood hazard area, if it's in a wetland, if it's in any of those areas, in addition to having that kind of application. So it has to meet both those tests. If it meets both those tests, then you have to do the neighborhood meeting. Now, there's nothing to stop you from doing a neighborhood meeting, even though the ordinance doesn't require you to, but in those situations, that's when we require a neighborhood meeting. In only those situations under this draft. And so that's something where, in the comment period, we'll hear from folks, whether we need more or less, or whether we need to expand that or not. But right now, the way the draft is written, that's all that's required. The only notice that's required right now are signs. So you have to put up signs. And so hopefully people driving by will, see, and that puts them on notice. There's an online notice provision, and it all has to be provided, anywhere from 30 to 10 days before you file your application, or before you have the actual meeting. So that's when you do it. I don't think there's you're right, there's an inconsistency here that I think we need to clear up, because some earlier drafts had references to mailed notice, and so those need to be taken out. So D1, B, and C need to be taken out. That was a good catch. Thanks, Matthew.
It may be worth a template of what that sign should look like. So there is a standard associated with that neighborhood meeting sign.
Yeah, that'd be a good thing, I think, to put in Article 12, where we have our submittal requirements.
Sure.
Any other questions or comments from the committee? Pratt, you looked like your lights were coming on.
Following up on Becca's question about converting a home, I was just looking at Government Street zoning, and that's labeled as a traditional corridor. And you've got old homes lining Government Street. You've got a number of condo, developments that have occurred there. It seems like the residents in that area, appreciate living, on that boulevard. Mm-hmm. But under the residential rights, that traditional corridor wouldn't allow any residential units to be built without, I guess, a rezoning.
Well, I think some of those areas, a lot of that is some of it's zoned or shown as low density residential. And in that case, it would just be an RL zoning district. Areas that are commercial in character today are designated for the traditional corridor zoning. So if there are specific areas that are residential today that maybe need to become RL, or maybe recognize uses that are already there, then we need to take a look at that. But there, looking at the map, there are some yellow shaded areas, and that's the low density or single family zoning, consistent with what you see, a mile or two outside of downtown along Government Street.
But like the Marine Street lofts, those wouldn't have been allowed, I guess, by right. And then, just a couple other those condo, like the Antoinette, would that have been allowed? I mean,
we'll need to take a look at the specific mapping categories of those parcels. I don't know off the top of my head what their future land use map is today, but that's something I think we need to go back and take a look at. And if we need to change the map on that, we can do that to make sure their uses are correct.
It just seems like one part of town where there's kind of a mixed use component where there's
Okay.
commercial and residential next door to each other.
Okay.
I noticed a little bit of that in the downtown district as well, that there was some residential types that already exist and maybe should be.
Okay.
And just to clarify, under Article 5, Section 6488, talking about certificates of occupancy, it clarifies in there on item 2 where a certificate of occupancy is required for any change of use for a new existing structure. A change of use occurs when a structure's primary function changes to another use as listed in Use Table 6427. Is that a sub-use, or is that if you're, say, for example, in media production and you change to manufacturing and light, is that a use? Is it within each use category, or is it across an entire use breadth?
The specific uses that are listed.
Okay.
So, if you go to that table, let me find where media production is.
Or even under personal and business services, I think as it's written now, if you stay business services to business services type, even if it's a different type of business services, it qualifies without a certificate of occupancy as far as a use for that building.
You're talking about personal services or
well, just
business
within any of the use categories. The use categories are broken into personal services. Then you've got I guess let me ask it this way: is it a use category personal business services versus retail sales, or are we talking under personal business services bail bonds versus business support services?
We're talking about you're talking about under retail, or you're talking about okay, bail bond. Yeah, if you change from bail bond services to business support, right? That's a C of O.
Okay.
Right. But if you're changing from, a graphics production business service to a packaging business service, you're still a business service.
Gotcha.
So that's where it comes. It's not only if you change from like bail bond to convenience store, which is bail bonds under personal business services and convenience stores under retail.
Right.
The use, I think I know what you're saying. So the use is those actual individual listed uses. And in the definitions section, right, of the ordinance, we have all the things that qualify as business support services. And so you can change from any one of those to any of the others, and you haven't changed your use.
Okay.
Right. But if you change from bail bond to business support or business support to bail bond, you've changed your use.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, good point. Thank you.
Does that also apply if you change from residential low density, which I understand is just a single family, to a residential mixed, which is up to a duplex? Is that correct?
I think you're talking about the zoning districts.
Correct.
Yeah, if you change zoning districts, that's not a change in use, that's a change in zoning.
Okay.
And so if your
not
property zone
necessarily
RL today and you want to build an apartment, you would have to rezone to RM, which allows apartments. RL does not allow apartments.
Right.
So that would trigger a rezoning case.
And duplex is considered apartment.
Duplex would be a form of multifamily.
Which is residential mixed. Maybe.
Right. Well, so they're actually allowed in RL as well. And so that's something we need to probably take a second look at.
Okay. That was maybe a little bit further clarification.
Okay.
Just reviewing, obviously residential low density is very, very clear, but residential mixed versus anything above as far as number of doors. Just further clarification on that. Or maybe I've missed it.
Yeah, if the use you want to make of your property is not allowed in the district that you're in, then you need to rezone.
Right.
You rezone to the district that allows that use. Okay. Anyone else? Any other thoughts or questions so far? I think I want to just jump on or piggyback on the comment that was made about downtown. That district was broken down into 3. Right now you have 7 what's called transect zones. We broke that down into 3 districts to streamline the ordinance. We're looking at, breaking that further out because there, like you mentioned, there are residential neighborhoods downtown that my thinking, drafting the ordinance, they would be zoned RL, but they're downtown, and they're in that downtown future land use category. So the same with some of the warehouse buildings that are down there that right now are SD, which means you need a master plan. But what we would like to have is something where you have specific standards they can build under. But those standards aren't the same as what you would want to apply in the D1, D2, or D3, where we've collapsed the major T categories in the transect zones. So those are some things we're looking at maybe adding to downtown so that we make sure the right use and the right standards apply to each of the areas, because downtown's a lot more complicated than other areas of the city that are more single use in character. So that's something that's we've had discussions on with various stakeholders, and those are changes we're looking at making to the ordinance.
Does that then make sense to do any type of overlay zoning for portions of that area?
Well, that would be a zoning district, just a base zoning district that we would allow, or that we would apply to downtown. It wouldn't be an overlay. It would just be it would just be its own zoning district category. The only overlay we have is the historic overlay, or historic development overlay that's carried forward from your existing regulations.
Mr. White, regarding downtown, are you saying you're looking into having further sub-districts in the downtown other than the 3 or the 4 that?
Yes, yeah, that's what we're looking at, expanding those sub-districts. Either, we can either add another category of RL, that's like an RL for downtown, right, that accommodates, what's happening in the residential areas, or add a category to downtown. And so, I know we've talked about different ways of doing that, but that's something we're looking at.
Okay. How does that relate to those mixed-use areas where there's residential usage allowed? So I'm thinking about the use category chart. Downtown allows certain types of residences, and those sub-districts within the downtown, therefore, subsequently allow those types of residences. Okay.
Right. Okay. Yes, downtown allows apartments. It allows apartment houses. It allows live-work dwellings, and I believe it allows the mixed-use buildings. So you can have the vertical.
It just automatically is inherent.
Stacking. Yeah, and that's by right. Yes.
So does D1, D2, and D3 eliminate any of that, or because the use?
No, they allow that.
They allow it. They're
anywhere
part of
in
the
downtown, you can have those uses.
Okay.
We don't have that separate use table that you've got for downtown. It's all sort of collapsed into one under this draft. And so I think some of the concern was by collapsing all those into 3 districts, now we have some non-residential uses in those residential areas today. And that's going to be a concern to the neighborhoods there. And so we either need to have a special RL category for downtown or a special downtown category for that
another
area.
D or something.
Yes.
One of the other concerns of the Downtown Alliance is that that the current Ds, the subcategories that you have, do they really address what's happening on the ground in the field as well? Do they accommodate the different? Like right now we have 6 sub-districts in the downtown. You're proposing 3 or 4. You might add another for residents, but do those 3 cover the varying characteristics that we currently?
Yes, because I think 2 of the transect zones were fairly almost identical to each other, and so that was an easy one, I think, to collapse. The core, I think, was an easy one. and, you know, there was one other. The wild
That
card
warehouse
has been what happens with the SD and what happens with the neighborhoods there,
Okay.
and how we deal with those. You know, my own preference has been for the single-family neighborhoods, we put a single-family district on them, but maybe with a downtown tag that recognizes that these are single-family. That's what's allowed there, nothing else. And then for the others, we'll take a look. You know, they could either fall under the adaptive reuse standards we're coming out with that would allow those buildings to develop as a number of different uses. They could become lofts, they could become a research laboratory, they could become something other than heavy industrial, right? Which I think has been the concern, is, you know, having a heavy industrial use in that part of downtown, as opposed to the port operations where it's zoned heavy industrial, and that's what it will stay. So, yeah, that's what we're taking a look at. And I'm going to cogitate over those adaptive reuse standards and see if, you know, that's something that covers it, or whether we actually need to add to, you know, the zoning map, add another category to it.
So in this zoning map that's forthcoming, the downtown district, those sub-districts will be shown, and
Right, that would be part of the zoning map. That would be shown on the map.
Okay.
Yep.
Since we're integrating, unifying the subdivision regulations with the zoning code, have I missed it? Are we going to look at some of the technical facets of the subdivision regulations linked with ratios, flag lots, those, you know, frontage, those kind of issues?
Yes, those are in Article 4. Those are where the development standards are. And some of those standards only apply to subdivisions. Like if you're putting a new street in, right, that only applies to subdivisions. That doesn't apply to a pure zoning approval on a single lot. So each of those subsections, and I noticed some of them near the back, I need to add, you know, what I've added in some of the earlier ones that indicate whether this applies to zoning and subdivision, or whether it just applies to subdivision approval. So your utility standards, those sorts of things, or subdivision standards. But those are in Article 4. That's where all that technical detail resides.
When you talk of Article 4, we have not seen that yet, correct? That's
No,
still-
that's online.
I don't have it.
We have
I don't
2,
have
3, and
one.
5, and
Article 4 should be online. Isn't it online?
If it
I
didn't
don't
make
have
it,
internet
if it
yet.
didn't make your copy, we'll email it out.
I don't think it made any of our copies.
3 to 6, 3 to 5.
There's your answer. We're for
I think it's on, you know, we've been putting these up for public review on the city's website, on the Map for Mobile website, I think it is. And I think Article 4 is there. It probably just didn't make it to the email that went out. So we'll make sure you
That
get
will bring a
access
few
to
more
that.
questions.
Yes, exactly.
So you know.
So you heard about it today, but now that you've heard about it, you'll get to see the standards in action.
is there a master list, table of contents of all the articles and where you plan?
There will be when we're done with all this. There'll be a list that shows you, each section, right? and major section and sections of the articles.
Not yet, though. That's not. it's
No,
not
there
an
isn't
outline
one
yet.
yet, but that's something we'll put together.
So it may seem like a minor thing, but in the differentiating between whether they're coming for a preliminary plat to the planning commission or a final plat to the planning commission, is the applicant going to make that decision, or is that going to be more of a staff look that looks at the application and judges the criteria?
No, it's defined by the number of lots. So if it's 5 or fewer, you don't need a preliminary plat. You just need final plat approval. Everything else goes to planning commission for preliminary plat approval. It's only the minor subdivisions that don't need to submit a preliminary plat. But what you put together with a minor plat, the difference is because state law requires planning commission to approve plats, the minor plat has to get approved by the planning commission. You just skip the preliminary plat stage there. You just go straight to final plat. So it sort of cuts that step out, but it still requires planning commission approval.
And that's 5 lots with no infrastructure.
Correct. Right. It mirrors the existing distinction that the city's made. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
I'll just
Yes,
quickly
Commissioner.
give kudos to you because I've been through this process for a very small municipality, and you have a tall task at your hand, and
Yeah.
I think you're doing a great job. So
Oh, well, thank you, Christopher. Appreciate it. And so are you all. I appreciate you taking your time. I know you all are busy. You've got your own jobs that you work on, and it's a, you know, it's a sacrifice to come here and to share your comments with us. So I can't express enough from my perspective and from the staff perspective, you know, the insights that you brought to us and you volunteering your time with us. So kudos to you all as well. So I appreciate it. All right. Thank you.
We do need to upload Article 4. It is not on the website, but we'll get that corrected, and we'll send out a notice to the public, and we will also send y'all emails directly, hopefully tomorrow, so you'll have a copy to review. And that'll be the first thing on our list when we meet again on the 29th, I believe it is, so that you've had adequate time to review that. We'll go back over that one. Our apologies for that. Okay, thank y'all.